There are 30,000 people living under your feet. Workers, families, children who will never see the sun. When the pipes started bleeding, nobody believed the janitor who found them first. He had no authority, no training, just a wire brush, and a choice nobody else could make. This is the story of how one floor scrubber burned an entire district alive to save the Hive, and why the Imperium will never admit it happened. I learned the smell of rot before I knew its name. The manufacturing vents of Hive Tertius were never clean, never silent, never kind. They were the bowels of a city that scraped the sky, a network of corroded arteries where the waste of 30 million souls moved in slow, viscous currents toward processing pits older than memory. I was a floor scrubber, one of thousands, a man whose entire existence could be summarized in the daily loi as a 6-digit identifier and a work shift notation. My name was called Brent, though nobody called me that. In the vents, I was simply the scrubber on rotation 7, the one who walked the eastern tunnels when the klaxons announced the start of third shift, carrying a plastic bucket and a wire brush that had outlived 3 previous handlers. The Emperor protects. Or so the preachers said during the mandatory dawn sermons piped through the Vox grills. Down here, the Emperor's protection manifested as a rebreather mask that barely filtered the air and a work quota that made sleep a luxury reserved for rest days that came once every 14 cycles. The vents smelled of grease and human effluence, of chemical runoff, and the peculiar tang of overheated metal that had been recycled too many times. That was normal. That was acceptable. The administratum had long ago determined the acceptable thresholds for atmospheric toxicity in sublevel workers, and we existed just beneath that threshold, breathing air that tasted of copper and decay, but would not kill us outright. I had walked these corridors for 11 years, since my 16th name, when my mother pressed my enrollment papers into my hand and told me the factorum floors were too dangerous for someone with my weak constitution. The vents were safer, she said, quieter. I would not be crushed by stamping presses or melted by promethium leaks. I would simply scrub and breathe and collect my ration chits, and perhaps live long enough to see my 30th year. She had been wrong about the quiet. The vents howled with the sound of rushing liquid, the groan of ancient pipes expanding and contracting, the distant thrum of massive filtration engines that turned filth into something marginally less lethal. But she had been right about the safety, at least until the day the cysts appeared. I noticed them on the 3rd morning of the month, the administrum designated as Septimus. The shift began as it always did with the descent down 17 flights of corroded stairs into the access hub where the work crews gathered to receive their assignments. Overseer Myth, a woman whose face had been half replaced by a crude augmentic after a pipe burst had scolded her 20 years prior, read from a data slate, without looking at us. Her remaining I was milky, half-blind, but her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had survived long enough to become indispensable. She assigned me to the eastern secondary vents, the same route I had walked 1,000 times before. The eastern vents ran parallel to the main sanitation arteries, carrying overflow from the processing districts when the primary channels became clogged. It was tedious work, scraping accumulation from the grates, checking pressure valves, ensuring nothing ruptured catastrophically. I took my bucket, my brush, my glow rod, and descended into the tunnels without a word. The first cyst was growing on the junction where pipe 7 met the overflow channel. It was small, no larger than my closed fist, a bulbous growth that protruded from the pipe's surface like a tumor. The metal around it had discolored, turning a mottled greenish-brown that reminded me of meat left too long in the heat. I stopped, holding my glow rod close, and stared at it. In 11 years, I had never seen anything grow on the pipes. Corrosion, yes. Rust and mineral buildup, certainly. But not this. Not something that looked almost organic, almost alive. The surface glistened in the weak light, slick with a moisture that dripped slowly onto the grated floor. I reached out, hesitated, then prodded it gently with the end of my brush. The growth yielded under pressure, soft and pliable, and a smell rose from it that made my stomach clench. It was not the usual smell of the vents. It was sweeter, richer, the smell of overripe fruit and spoiled milk, and something else I could not name. I pulled my hand back and made a notation in the small leather-bound logbook. All scrubbers were required to carry. Anomalous growth on Pipe 7 junction. Recommend inspection. I moved on, trying to ignore the unease that had settled into my chest. By mid-shift, I had found 6 more. They varied in size. Some small as pebbles, others as large as a human head, clustered around pipe joints and valve housings like fungal blooms. The discoloration spread outward from each one, staining the metal in patterns that reminded me of bruises on skin. The smell grew stronger as I moved deeper into the eastern vents, a cloying sweetness that penetrated even my rebreather mask. I documented each one, my handwriting growing shakier as the list lengthened. The tunnels felt different now, oppressive in a way they had never been before. The sound of the pipes seemed louder, more irregular, as though something were moving inside them that should not be there. I told myself it was nothing, that the Mechanica servitors would identify the problem during their monthly inspection rounds, that this was not my concern beyond making a report. But the unease remained, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. When I returned to the access hub at shift's end, I handed my logbook to Overseer Minth and waited while she read my notations. Her milky, I did not move, but her good one scanned the pages with increasing speed. She closed the logbook and looked at me for the first time in months. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of irritation and something that might have been concern. She told me to report to the eastern vents again the following shift to monitor the growths and document any changes. She did not tell me what she thought they were. She did not tell me to avoid them. She simply handed back the logbook and dismissed me with a wave of her augmentatic hand. I climbed the 17 flights of stairs to the worker habitation blocks, my legs aching, my lungs burning with the effort of breathing recycled air for 12 hours straight. I ate my ration of protein paste and fungal bread in silence, surrounded by other scrubbers who spoke in low voices about quotas and equipment failures and the rumor that the upper hive had increased water rationing again. Nobody mentioned the cysts. Nobody had seen what I had seen. That night, I dreamed of pipes that breathed. The second shift into the eastern vents confirmed my fears. The cysts had grown. The small ones from the previous day were now the size of my head, their surfaces stretched toward and gleaming with that strange moisture. The larger ones had swollen grotesquely, some now as big as a man's torso, pressing against the tunnel walls and forcing me to squeeze past them to reach the deeper sections. The discoloration had spread dramatically, covering entire sections of pipe in that mottled greenish-brown. Worse, some of the cysts had begun to weep. Thick, viscous fluid oozed from splits in their surfaces, dripping onto the floor in slow, steady streams. The smell was overpowering now, so strong that I vomited into my rebreather mask and had to stop to clean it, my hands shaking. I documented everything with frantic precision, filling page after page of my logbook with measurements, locations, descriptions. The pipes were definitely making new sounds now, wet, gurgling noises that rose and fell in rhythm, as though something vast were breathing through the entire network. I was not alone in the vents that day. Midway through my shift, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Overseer Meth herself descending into the tunnel, accompanied by a figure I did not recognize. The stranger wore the rust-red robes of the Adeptus Mechanicus, though they were stained and tattered in a way that suggested long service in the Underhive. His face was hidden behind a rebreather far more sophisticated than mine, and his hands were entirely augment, fingers ending in delicate manipulator tools. He carried a handheld Auspex, its screen flickering with green light. Minth introduced him as Engine Seer Tove assigned to the Sanitation District's maintenance cadre. She told me to show him the cysts. I led them through the tunnels, stopping at each growth to let Torvis scan it with his Auspex. He said nothing, his body language impossible to read beneath the robes. When we reached the largest cluster, a mass of cysts that had grown together into a single bulging wall of diseased flesh, blocking nearly half the tunnel, he finally spoke. His voice was mechanical, filtered through his rebreather into a flat monotone. The readings were consistent with biological contamination, bacterial proliferation on an unprecedented scale, possible fungal interaction, origin unknown. He paused, adjusting settings on his Auspex. Recommendation: immediate quarantine and purge protocols. Men asked how long a purge would take. Tove tilted his head, his augmentatic eyes clicking as they refocused. With current resources, and assuming containment holds, approximately 48 hours, if contamination has spread to the primary arteries, significantly longer. He looked at me then, and I saw something in his mechanical gaze that might have been pity. You should not return to this section. The risk of infection is non-trivial. They left me standing in the tunnel staring at the wall of cysts. I did not return to the eastern vents the next day. Overseer Minth reassigned me to the western channels, safer territory far from the contamination, but the change of location did nothing to ease my mind. I could not stop thinking about those growths, about the way they had swelled and wept, about the smell that had burned itself into my memory. The other scrubbers began to whisper. Rumors spread through the worker habitation blocks like wildfire. Someone said the eastern vents had been sealed. Someone else claimed they had seen our bites moving into the lower levels, their carapace armor gleaming in the glow rod light. A third voice insisted that entire work crews had been quarantined, locked in their dormitories without explanation. I kept my head down and scrubbed my assigned channels, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of work. The quarantine lasted 3 days before it broke. I was not there when it happened. I learned about it the way everyone in the Underhive learns about disaster, through fragmented reports and panicked rumors that spread faster than any official communication. A pipe had burst in the eastern secondary vents. Not a normal rupture, not the kind that spilled water or waste or chemical runoff. This was something else. The reports were confused, contradictory, but the core facts emerged quickly enough. When the pipe burst, it had released a cloud of spores into the air, a thick greenish mist that spread through the tunnels with unnatural speed. The workers who had been sealing the contaminated section were caught in the initial release. Within hours, they began to change. The symptoms started with fever and nausea, progressing rapidly to open sores and serrating wounds. Their skin turned the same mottled greenish-brown as the cysts on the pipes. They vomited fluids that reek of decay. Some collapsed and did not rise again. Others kept moving, shambling through the tunnels with their bodies visibly rotting, spreading the infection to anyone they encountered. The Arbites moved in with flommers and sealed the eastern vents completely. But the spores had already spread beyond the initial breach. The ventilation systems that circulated air through the lower manufacturing districts carried the contamination to new areas, new pipes, new workers. Cysts began appearing in the western channels, then in the northern processing yards, then in the habitation blocks themselves. The Administrum issued a quarantine order for the entire subble, sealing the main access points and posting armed guards at every stairwell. No one was permitted to ascend to the upper hive. No one was permitted to leave their assigned districts. The official explanation broadcast through crackling Vox speakers spoke of a localized sanitation failure and assured us that Mechanicus technicians were working to resolve the issue. They did not mention the spores. They did not mention the workers who had turned into walking corpses. They did not mention the word plague. I saw my first infected on the 5th day of the quarantine. His name had been July, a scrubber who worked the northern channels. I had shared meals with him in the communal feeding hall, had listened to him complain about his failing joints, and the overseer who docked his ration chits for minor infractions. Now he stumbled through the corridor outside my dormitory, his body bent and twisted by growths that erupted from his flesh like the cysts on the pipes. His skin had split in dozens of places, revealing separating tissue beneath. The smell that came from him was the same sweet rot I had first encountered in the eastern vents, magnified 1,000 times. He did not seem to see me. His eyes were clouded, filmed over with a milky substance. He walked with a lurching gait, one arm hanging useless at his side, the other reaching out as though grasping for something only he could perceive. I pressed myself against the wall and held my breath as he passed, praying he would not notice me. He did not. He continued down the corridor, leaving a trail of viscous fluid behind him, and disappeared into the shadows. The Arbite's barriers fell on the 7th day. I was not there to witness it, but the sound carried through the entire subble. A massive detonation followed by the staccato crack of lost gunfire followed by screaming. The infection had spread to the Arbite's checkpoint at the primary access stairwell, overwhelming the guards despite their armor and weapons. Infected workers swarmed the barricades, driven by something that might have been hunger or might have been simple mindless compulsion. The Arbites held for nearly an hour before falling back, sealing emergency bulkheads behind them and abandoning the lower districts entirely. We were alone now. Thousands of workers trapped in a labyrinth of corridors and tunnels with an infection that turned flesh into rotting mulch and showed no signs of stopping. The Vox speakers went silent. The glow rods began to fail as power distribution faltered. In the darkness, the sounds of the infected grew louder. That was when I remembered the purifiers. The waste purifiers were ancient mechanisms installed during the Hive's construction millennia ago. Massive furnace engines designed to incinerate biological waste when the standard filtration systems became overwhelmed. They occupied a sub beneath the eastern vents, a cavernous space I had visited exactly once during my training when Overseer Mint had led the new scrubbers on a tour of the critical infrastructure. She had explained in her flat, emotionless voice that the purifiers were relics of a more brutal age when the Hive's population had been smaller and the Mechanicus less concerned with efficiency than with absolute sterilization. The purifiers could generate temperatures high enough to reduce organic matter to ash in seconds. They had not been activated in over 3 centuries, deemed too destructive, too wasteful of resources. But the mechanisms remained, maintained by servitors who performed their rituals without understanding, waiting for an activation command that might never come. I had no authority to access the purifiers. I had no training in their operation. I was a floor scrubber, a man whose entire technical education consisted of learning which pipes could be safely touched and which valves should never be turned. But I also knew that the infection was spreading, that the barriers had fallen, that the administratum had abandoned us to die in the darkness. I knew that if the spores reached the upper hive, if they spread through the ventilation systems into the factoriums and hab towers and administrative districts, millions would die. The entire hive might fall. And I knew with a certainty that felt like cold iron in my chest that no one was coming to save us. I left my dormitory before dawn on the 8th day. The corridors were nightmare landscapes now. The cysts had spread to the walls themselves, growing in thick clusters that pulsed with a rhythm that mimicked breathing. The floor was slick with the fluids that wept from their surfaces, forcing me to move carefully to avoid slipping. Infected workers wandered in small groups, their bodies so thoroughly corrupted that I could no longer recognize individual faces. Some had collapsed where they stood, their corpses serving as substrate for new growths that sprouted from their rotting flesh. The air was thick with spores, visible as a faint greenish haze in the few remaining glow rods. I wrapped a strip of cloth around my face, knowing it would do nothing against true contamination, but needing the psychological comfort of a barrier. I carried my glow rod in one hand and my log book in the other, clinging to these familiar tools as though they could protect me from what I was about to attempt. The path to the purifier sub led through the eastern vents. I knew this. I had known this since the memory surfaced. There was no other route, no alternative access. The eastern vents, where the infection had begun, where the cysts grew thickest, where the air itself seemed to writhe with living corruption. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, staring into the darkness, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I thought of Jay shambling through the corridors with his body split open. I thought of the workers who had been caught in the initial spore release, who had rotted alive in a matter of hours. I thought of my mother, who lived somewhere in the mid-hive, who might still be safe if I could stop this before it climbed higher. I took a breath that tasted of sweet decay and stepped into the tunnel. The eastern vents had become something alien. The cysts covered every surface now, forming a continuous carpet of diseased flesh that squelched beneath my boots. The pipes were no longer visible, buried beneath layers of growth. The tunnel had narrowed as the biomass expanded, forcing me to walk hunched over in places, my shoulders brushing against surfaces that felt warm and slightly yielding. The smell was indescribable, a concentrated essence of rot so powerful that it felt physical, like a weight pressing against my face. My eyes watered, my stomach heaved. I forced myself forward, step by step, following the route from memory. The sounds were worse than the smell. The wet breathing rhythm had intensified, no longer an occasional gurgle, but a constant rasping wheeze that filled the tunnel. And beneath it, I heard other sounds. Whispers, laughter, voices that spoke in languages I did not know. That might not have been languages at all, but simply the random firing of a diseased mind interpreting noise as meaning. I found the first body halfway to the sub. It was one of the Arbites who had been guarding the eastern vent seals. His carapace armor was scorched and cracked as though he had stood against a flamer. But that had not killed him. The cysts had grown through the cracks, burrowing into his flesh, transforming him into a hybrid of man and corruption. His face was still recognizable, frozen in an expression of absolute horror. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. I stepped around him carefully, trying not to think about what his last moments must have been like, trying not to imagine the feeling of foreign growth pushing through skin and muscle and bone. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and I stopped. Before me was a scene from the deepest pits of hell. The chamber had once been a junction hub where multiple pipe systems converged before descending to the purifiers. Now it was a cathedral of decay. The cysts had merged into massive structures, towering columns of diseased biomass that rose from floor to ceiling. They pulsed with a bioluminescent glow, sickly green light that illuminated the space in shifting patterns. The floor was no longer visible, replaced by a thick carpet of something that moved slightly when I watched it, as though breathing. And scattered throughout the chamber were bodies. Dozens of them, workers, Arbites, even what looked like a Mechanicus servitor. All of them consumed by the growth. All of them transformed into living architecture for this impossible garden of rot. I saw movement in the shadows. They emerged slowly, figures that had once been human, but were now something else entirely. Their bodies were so thoroughly corrupted that calling them infected seemed inadequate. They were walking ecosystems, hosts for 1,000 different strains of decay. Fungal blooms sprouted from their shoulders. Their skin had split to reveal layers of new growth beneath. Their eyes were gone, replaced by clusters of smaller growths that might have served some analogous function. They moved with purpose, not the shambling gait of the newly infected, but with a terrible coordination that suggested intelligence. They were tending the cysts. I realized with dawning horror, touching them gently, adjusting their positions, nurturing them like gardeners cultivating crops. This was not random infection. This was cultivation. This was purpose. One of them noticed me. It turned its eyeless head in my direction, the growths that replaced its eyes flexing and contracting. It made a sound, a wet clicking that might have been communication. The others stopped their work and turned as well. I counted 7 of them, standing among the columns of diseased flesh, regarding me with what felt like curiosity. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, human and post-human, separated by a transformation I could barely comprehend. Then one of them took a step toward me, extending an arm that ended not in a hand, but in a cluster of writhing tendrils. I ran. I crashed through the chamber, my boots splashing through the living carpet, my shoulders colliding with columns that yielded like flesh behind me. I heard them following their footsteps, making wet slapping sounds against the biomass. They did not run. They did not need to. They knew these tunnels better than I did now. Knew every shortcut and passage. But I had one advantage. I remembered the route to the purifier sub. I had walked it once 11 years ago, following Overseer Menth and memorizing every turn because that was what I did. That was who I was. A man who recorded details in leather-bound logbooks and remembered pipe junction numbers long after they ceased to matter. The access shaft appeared on my left, exactly where memory said it should be. I dove through the opening and down the maintenance ladder, my hands slipping on rungs that were slick with moisture. The shaft descended into darkness, the glow rod's light barely penetrating the gloom. I could hear them above me, their clicking communication echoing down the shaft. One of them leaned over the edge, looking down at me with its eyeless face. It did not follow. It simply watched as I descended, as though confident that I would fail in whatever I was attempting. The thought filled me with rage, a hot anger that cut through the fear and exhaustion. I would not fail. I would not let this infection climb into the upper hive. I would burn it all away, even if it meant burning myself with it. The shaft ended at a sealed hatch. I recognized it immediately. Heavy plastel marked with the cog and skull symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus, surrounded by warning sigils in High Gothic that proclaimed the area beyond restricted to authorized tech priests and servitors. During my training, Overseer Meth had opened this hatch with a key card that hung from her belt. I had no key card. I had nothing but a glow rod and a wire brush and a desperate need to reach what lay beyond. I examined the hatch carefully, looking for any weakness, any flaw in its construction. The seal was intact, the locking mechanism pristine, despite centuries of neglect. I could not force it. I could not break it. But as I ran my hands over the surface, feeling for seams or access points, my fingers found something unexpected. A small panel barely visible in the dim light set into the frame beside the hatch. A manual override installed during the age when human hands still operated these systems before servitors and machine spirits took over all maintenance. I pressed the panel and it clicked open, revealing a simple lever. I pulled the lever and the hatch unsealed with a hiss of pressurized air. Beyond was the purifier chamber. It was vast, far larger than I remembered, a cavern carved from the bedrock beneath the hive. The purifiers themselves dominated the space. 3 massive cylindrical structures that rose from floor to ceiling like pillars supporting the weight of the world above. They were ancient, their surfaces covered in patina and corrosion, but the fundamental architecture remained sound. Pipes fed into them from above, carrying waste from the entire sublevel network. Exhaust vents opened in the ceiling, presumably leading to atmospheric processes that would filter the smoke before releasing it into the hive's air circulation. And surrounding each purifier was a network of smaller mechanisms, pumps and valves, and pressure regulators, all maintained by servitors who stood motionless in loves along the walls. The servitors noticed me immediately. They were old models, their bodies more machine than flesh, their faces blank metal masks. They did not speak. They did not move to stop me. They simply observed their optical sensors tracking my movement across the chamber. I walked slowly toward the nearest purifier, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. Up close, the machine was even more impressive. The surface was inscribed with prayers and high Gothic liturgies to the Omnisia, asking for blessing and proper function. A control console jutted from the base, its surface covered in switches and dials and gauges whose purposes I could only guess at. And beside the console, protected by a glass case marked with warning symbols, was a large red lever. The primary activation control. I realized the switch that would wake these sleeping giants and turn the subble into an inferno. But I hesitated. Pulling that lever would not be a simple matter of destruction. The purifiers were designed to incinerate the waste that flowed through the pipes, not to sterilize an entire district. If I activated them without proper preparation, without adjusting flow rates and pressure settings, the result would be catastrophic. The pipes would rupture. The heat would spread uncontrollably. The entire substructure would collapse, bringing down habitation blocks and work areas and everything else. And everyone still alive down here, everyone who had not yet been infected would die screaming in the flames. The Administrum report that Overseer Mint had shown us during training had listed the purifier capacity at 300,000 L of biological waste per hour. A hive district held far more than that. The calculations were simple and terrible. To burn out the infection completely, to ensure no spore survived to spread upward, I would need to flood the purifiers with every pipe in the network simultaneously, overwhelming them until the heat reached critical mass and consumed everything. I would need to sacrifice the entire district. 30,000 workers called the sublevel home. Families, children, people who had committed no crime other than being born in the wrong section of the hive, who had worked their entire lives in service to the Emperor and the Imperium. I thought of Joel shambling through corridors with his body rotting.